and Jeremy organized a student group called Agape, which stands for Archetypal Geometry
and Philosophy.
Exploratorium. And I participated in that with him last year, along with several other PCC students. Liz was there a lot. And Jeremy, obviously coming from his Waldorf background as a math and science teacher, was able to introduce us to a form of geometry that has life and that activates imagination, and that, I've never experienced a math teacher inviting creativity and participation in the discovery of archetypal form in the geometrical mode, as well as Jeremy was able to do it. I think we need more teachers like him in the world to introduce people to the magic of mathematics, and I'm very excited to see what he's going to initiate us into today regarding another form of geometrical space, sun space, etheric space. He's going to turn our imaginations inside out, so get ready. Please welcome Jeremy.
Okay.
Sorry. They were reading my chart, and I just...
Yeah, the charts, they did do that. Okay. So, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now because I put so much energy into preparing this for a long time, and I have so much material just waiting to happen. There's this expression, your eyes bigger than your stomach. Sometimes your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Well, I feel like right now my consciousness is bigger than my mouth. And there's no way I'm going to be able to articulate what I would like to in the next minuscule amount of time. But I'm just going to see what happens. I really wanted to start with a couple quotes from Gebser's Ever-Present Origin to kind of frame what I'm going to talk about here. And it plays a lot into what Rick said this morning. It was very beautiful. Hopefully you'll see some of these connections. Scarcely 500 years ago, during the Renaissance, an unmistakable reorganization of our consciousness occurred. The discovery of perspective, which opened up the three-dimensionality of space. Perspective is the preeminent expression of the emergent consciousness of 15th century European man, the palpable expression of his objectification of spatial awareness. Perspectival vision and thought confine us within spatial limitations. Elsewhere, we have alluded to the antithesis inherent in perspective. It locates and determines the observer as well as the observed. The positive result is a concretion of man and space. The negative result is the restriction of man to a limited segment where he perceives only one sector of reality. Space is the insistent concern of this era, the rational structure, the perspectival structure of consciousness. In underscoring this assertion, we have relied only on the testimony of its most vivid manifestation, the discovery of perspective. We did, however, mention in passing that at the very moment when Leonardo discovers space and solves the problem of perspective, thereby creating the possibility for spatial objectification in painting, other events occur which parallel his discovery. Copernicus, for example, shatters the limits of the geocentric sky and discovers heliocentric space. Columbus goes beyond the encompassing Oceanus to discover Earth's space. Vesalius, the first major anatomist, bursts the confines of Galen's ancient doctrines of the human body and discovers the body's space. Harvey destroys the precepts of Hippocrates' humoral medicine and reveals the circulatory system. And there is Kepler, who by demonstrating the elliptical orbit of the planets overthrows antiquity's unperspectival world image of circular and flat surfaces that dated back to Ptolemy's conception of the circular movement of the planets. Okay, so given all that, let's hear the end result. The overemphasis on space and spatiality that increases with every century since 1500 is at once the greatness as well as the weakness of perspectival man. His overemphasis on the objectively external, a consequence of an excessively visual orientation, leads not only to rationalization, but to an unavoidable hypertrophy of the eye, which is in confrontation with the external world. This exaggeration of the I amounts to what we may call ego hypertrophy. The I must be increasingly emphasized, indeed overemphasized, in order for it to be adequate to the ever-expanding discovery of space. At the same time, the increasing materialization of space which confronts the ego occasions a corresponding rigidification of the ego itself. The expansion of space brings on the gradual expansion and consequent disintegration of the I on the one hand, preparing favorable circumstances for collectivism, and on the other hand, the haptification of space rigidifies and encapsulates the I, with the resultant possibility of isolation evident in egocentrism. Okay, so that's my inspiration to tackle a reconceptualization of space. And within the realm of geometry, there's a principle known as the principle of polarity that makes this really accessible. And what I want to try to do is demonstrate that geometry and how it actually manifests in the physical world as we know it around us. Oh, that was supposed to be there when you heard all that. But okay, so here's a circle, and here are all the points defining this circle. And this is a common definition of what a circle is. But every point on the circumference of the circle has its corresponding tangent. And in fact, we can imagine that a circle is rather defined not by the points that are within it, but the lines sort of circumscribing it. Now, three-dimensionally, which I kind of want to try to bring this up here, this really should be more appropriately viewed like this. If I were to draw every one of those lines in, the space surrounding the circle or the sphere would be completely solid. It's not just filled with lines. Imagine all the lines, just as all the points put this together, all the lines would fill the space around it. Okay, so when those points move away from the circumference, the line that corresponds to it, in this case, moves away. If this was in 3 dimensions, and this was my sphere, and this is my point, as this moves away, a point interior to the sphere would move closer to the center of the sphere. So, what happens then as all of those points collectively as a circle collapse towards the center? Then all the lines circumscribing that circle would expand away from the circle. And what then would happen when all those points collapse into a center point? Where do those lines that were outside that circle go? Well, they go to the infinitely distant, all-encompassing plane of space, which is not an easy imagination to take on. But one thing would be to imagine just this dome we're sitting in, perfectly spherical, and just imagine it as far as possibly you can, just in every direction, and it would give you some idea of where those lines went. A completely, infinitely distant plane surrounding all of space. So just to kind of re-articulate that again, from the middle, from the beginning, here's a center radiating out from that center, and as it does so, those lines then are coming in to meet it, so that they converge again and co-appear as the circumference of this circle. So that is one way of getting into this idea that the point and the plane, in this case this is a line because it's 2 dimensions, but the plane of space are polar to each other with respect to this sphere. And so we can start to imagine that the dynamics that take place within are reflected and inverted without. Okay, so, oh, I did it again. Now you can't hardly see that, I imagine, huh? Well, what? So you can see the thing on the left, but the right side is really a number of lines. I don't know if you can see that. And they're concentric rings. Something like that. Whereas here we have points radiating out. That's the idea. I guess you can't see the blue too well. Anyway, so what I want to do here, just to outline, for example, what's embodied in this movement here. So this polarity that we just looked at has as its two extremes what we would call the center, let me write from over here, and the periphery. Now, if we look at it in terms of movement, from the center, from this circle, if we contract down into the center, we're actually approaching what we would call the center of gravity. And if we expanded away outside from that center of gravity, we would get radial, and we could even give it a radial linear geometric movement as embodied in that. If you just imagine. So to really appreciate this polarity, it's not enough just to look at these images, but to get into what is the feeling embodied in radiating out versus this alternative that we're about to talk about. But for now, we're looking at this, the center of gravity from which objects can move. Let's see what else we're going to write there. But this radial expansion has a limit. And the limit, in this case, for the point, is an infinitely distant plane. The all-encompassing plane that's in all directions, embodied by those lines as they radiated out. Okay, now here comes the fun part. And just by the way, if I ever run out of time and I don't say everything I would like to say, just put everything you've ever thought about Newtonian, Cartesian, pointwise, atomistic, materialistic, reductionistic, disenchanted thinking over here. Okay? And start to imagine how geometrically at first, but what we'll soon see botanically, there's another world possible. There's another space that's actually as mathematically lawful as this space has come to be for us. And that this space offers a lot of potential for reconceptualization of the world, basically. Okay. So, what is the mirror reflection over here relative to those ideas I put there? So, here, instead of here the center of gravity, we have to imagine that when the periphery, when these peripheral movements contract, quote unquote contract, that would be a return to the not the center of gravity, but the plane of the periphery. That, for these lines, is a contraction. It's a return to the source of these lines, or these planes rather. So an expansion then, a movement out of its source towards its infinite limit here, is not radial but peripheral. Or no, not peripheral, enveloping. That we have these sheaves, these planes that are more sculptural than anything, coming from out of the infinitely distant plane and coming in and circling this circle for now. And then finally, the limit then for those encircling planes is not the infinitely distant plane, which is its origin, but the inner infinitude. We could say the infinite point, which is the center. And to imagine that that center point from the peripheral perspective is infinitely far away. It's infinitely instant. And approaching it and never always getting further and further away from within. Okay, so I wanted to put that framework up so then to appreciate now what's happening when we look at a plant. So, can you see that? Yeah. Wow. I almost feel like I should just turn that screen around. Okay. Well, it's okay. How are we doing on time?
We have 6 minutes.
Remaining.
I'm not making that up.
Okay. That's that. So, here's the diaphragm of the Earth. There's a root growing into the Earth, drawn by the center of gravity. And as it goes down, it's radiating out. Smaller, well, the longer roots being back here because they're older in time, so to speak. But this whole movement of the roots is embodied in this radial gesture and everything we talked about in terms of pointwise movement. And let's see. That's not much better, huh? It's actually quite remarkable that it's very true even when you point at these things. Right here. Here's a root tip, and that's the center of growth for the root. And everything flowing past or behind it, so to speak, is the remains of what the root is. So the growth tip of a root is right here as it penetrates through the soil, embodying this radial gesture that I spoke of. And what's more, the vascular cylinder in the interior there is where all the xylem and phloem, all the flow of fluids and sap, is centric. And secondary roots that grow out from the center start at that vascular cylinder. They don't start outside. They start from the center and radiate out from within. Now, so there we are. That's the geometric embodiment of the kind of growth forces we see in roots. Now, you can't see this, but I guess I'll draw it. The stem, however, is a series of unfolding leaves. And something like that, contracting together. But these are an embodiment of a movement that's more like this. So that this point right here has been traveling all the way, and these leaves have been falling out of this movement like a wave. So a good way to imagine that, I think, is to imagine a drop of water and the pool of waves radiating out from that. Now, reverse that process. Picture rather an oceanic plain that's coming together and out of which the drop falls. Now, a drop, in our case, is a leaf. And each leaf is a rhythmic unfolding of this in-streaming planar. This is actually more spherical than in this plane. This in-streaming of forces, you could say, are then expressed through this plant. And you can see that also, if you could see anything at all here, in the fact that every plant has at its growing tip, on the shoot rather, we look up here, this point up here is always a hollow space. And every plant, every tree, every grass, there are variations on the theme, but they all are encircling and enveloping a hollow space, which is the inner infinitude center of an etheric space. So the plant is living in these two spaces, the physical world and the etheric world. And again, vascular bundles, unlike the roots, are actually all arranged peripherally. And even the extreme version, if you look at a tree, the actual living vascular cambium of a tree is only within a few inches of the periphery, no matter how big the tree is. And the core of it, the center of it, is the corpus, so to speak, the wood. So, I guess we'll finish with this image. So, the basic idea I'm trying to get at here, 4 minutes remaining? All right. The basic idea that I'm trying to capture here is that through this polarity, we can start to use our imagination to invert everything we thought we knew about the way space is structured and the way forces live or operate within that space. So to add to that list here, I would write where this is the realm of matter, this is the realm of light. Where this is convex growth, here we have concave. And where this would, say, be physical or earthly, this would be cosmic or etheric. And hence, the reason that if this is our Earth space and all of our science is being geared around this idea of a center and particles and gravity as the embodiment of forces at work in space, we can geometrically start to imagine the other space, the space that all plants are living in, simultaneously, this sun space. And in fact, I would suggest or propose or imagine that it's quite interesting, and this will be, I guess, my last thought, is that this right here, that's the glyph of the sun, right? And it's an expression of the way we think about the sun and the whole world. It's a way of, via Copernicus in this heliocentric space, we've projected everything we've learned by being earthbound, ego-conscious individuals and embodied it in this glyph and in our conceptual schema of the space around us. And I'm proposing or suggesting or imagining, and you could do this too if you look at any plant out there, is that we can start to imagine that the sun, being the focal lens and the center point for all these forces that stream out of the cosmos into the plant, taking on this imagination of the sun, I think would do great to bring balance to the world we live in. Yeah, so I'm just going to have to stop. So. I guess if you're interested in more, just stop me anywhere on the trail and we'll look at plants and you'll see it further. Yeah.
You have a few minutes? Yeah.
I'll try to make it quick.
Beautiful, Jeremy. Quick question. Could this insight that you're working with have happened without the prior differentiation of perspectival space?
No.
Okay, that's great. And so you're actually working in an integral mode. It's not just a recovering of a pre-perspectival space. It's an okay.
Aperspectival is the next one.
Right. Okay, and just a quick question. Presumably the root structures of plants also have an etheric body.
Yes.
But you're suggesting here, though, that the etheric is more inhabits more the illuminated above ground space rather than the earth space.
Right.
Could you comment on that?
The only thing I could say with regard to that would be to do something like this. That's the bigger picture. They're embedded within each other. I can only give you the fundamental polarity, but within the roots you see that there is, yes, the cosmic at work, and within the physical unfolding of the leaves above, there's also the earthly at work.
Great.
But didn't have time for that. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Maybe one more question.
So that's a beautiful picture that you envision. I was wondering if the same type of perspectives happen to plants and the entire Earth from the other planets. Also, a similar kind of.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing I wanted to include. I'll just do another real quick diagram to replace a lot of words. So here's the infinite periphery. I would call this also maybe even the zodiac or all the stars. But those forces kind of oceanically encompassing and enveloping from without inwards then pass through the planets where they pick up rhythms, you could say. And all of that then gets focused in a way through the sun and into plant growth on the earth. So yes, this is a huge factor, and if I had more time I would show how pedantically we could see the demonstration of planetary rhythms in the very geometric swelling of all leaf and fruit flower buds. But again, time. I just mentioned finally that this way of perspective, I think, actually is a way of embodying and starting to imagine the concretion of time that Gebser talks about. It's also very tied with Goethe's Erfpflanze. I can't really elaborate these ideas, but I'm hoping that they plant some seeds. So, yeah. Oh, in fact, that reminds me. One last image. I swear I'm going to stop. So the question is, here's a seed, right? And what is a seed? Or more appropriately, now, where is a seed? A seed is simultaneously, physically, an anchor point for what is resting at that moment in the etheric cosmos. And it's when we introduce water and bring about germination that those etheric forces and that kind of archetypal idea of that plant in particular can then work through this focal point and into physical expression. So, seed to seed. Okay, I'm done.